All right, let's dive right in. Today, we're looking at a truly incredible turnaround story. We're talking about how a massive nation literally dismantled decades of bureaucratic red tape to completely transform its modern economy. You guessed it, we're exploring India's new economic policy. This was a sweeping set of reforms back in the late 20th century that, honestly, laid the entire groundwork for the global economic powerhouse we know today.
To really understand this massive macroeconomic shift, we're going to walk through the stifling pre-1991 license permit Raj, introduce the 4 pillars of reform, and track the early wins. Then, we'll look at the hurdles in implementation, and finally, wrap up with a final assessment of the data.
Part 1. The License Permit Raj, an economy in chains.
So, to get why these reforms were so desperately needed, we have to look at the massive problem India faced from the 1950s all the way into the 80s. Picture this, the state essentially had a monopoly. They were building heavy industries, dams, massive infrastructure, but the returns were remarkably poor. I mean, they were operating with zero cost consciousness and just crushing bureaucratic inefficiency. And on the flip side, the private sector was totally handcuffed by what was known as the License Permit Raj. Want to expand your business? Good luck navigating that maze of intricate licensing. The MRTP Act actually prevented large industrial investments, and foreign money, yeah, that was completely scared off. Basically, the entire economy was just stuck. Which brings us to part 2, 4 pillars of reform. The turnaround begins.
The pressure had been building for a while. The realization that the system was fundamentally broken finally set the stage for a dramatic solution. Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi actually sparked the initial phase of this with a pretty explosive statement in 1985. He officially acknowledged that the public sector had, frankly, overreached. It was in too many areas where it just shouldn't be. And this led to the very first steps of decontrol, freeing up industries like cement, drugs, and electronics, and finally raising the asset limits for big business houses.
But, well, Gandhi didn't push it all the way. The true paradigm shift, that happened in 1991 under Prime Minister Narasimha Rao. This is when the new economic policy was formally launched, and its nature and scope were built on 4 massive foundational pillars: liberalization, reform of the public sector, privatization, and globalization. Let's zoom in on that first and arguably most famous pillar. Liberalization was all about just cutting the red tape. The core sector was finally opened up. The government abolished industrial licensing for almost all projects, down to just a tiny list of 18 restricted industries. Almost overnight, consumer items, what they called white goods like refrigerators and washing machines, were taken off restricted lists. Suddenly, a booming middle class of over 100 million people could actually buy cars and modern appliances, simply because companies no longer needed government permission just to build the things.
And that naturally leads us to another crucial pillar, globalization. This was a total game changer. It literally meant swinging the country's doors wide open to integrate the Indian economy with the rest of the world. We're talking about allowing the free, unrestricted flow of goods, services, capital, and technology right across its borders.
Part 3. Early wins and progress. Cutting the tape. Because once these policies were enacted, the progress on the business environment was almost immediate. The government moved fast to draw barriers to global trade. They aggressively slashed maximum import tariffs from a staggering 150% all the way down to 50% in just a few years. And customs duties on capital goods, those dropped from 80% down to 25%. And wow, did the market respond. That sudden openness created an incredible 85% spike in exports over just a 5-year period. By the 1996 to 97 window, exports had jumped from about $17 billion to over $33 billion US dollars. The tape wasn't just cut, it was completely shredded.
Part 4. Hurdles in implementation. The messy reality.
But, as we all know, theory is one thing, and practice is another. Implementing a massive macroeconomic overhaul is never, ever perfectly smooth. Take the public sector, for instance. Reforming it meant dealing with massive overstaffing. So the government sets up the National Renewal Fund to help workers affected by these huge shifts. But here's the catch. While over 800 crores were paid out for voluntary retirement, absolutely crucial programs like worker retraining were totally neglected. So people got their buyouts, sure, but they didn't get the skills they actually needed to re-enter this newly modernized workforce.
And the way they handled privatization? Yeah, highly controversial. Critics hit the nail on the head when they called it deficit privatization. See, instead of true reform, where a government might sell assets to actually strengthen weak units or upgrade old tech, the government here just sold off shares of its healthiest, most profitable state assets. Why? Simply to plug holes in its own central budget. It was a quick fix, not a structural upgrade. Then there was the actual nature of the foreign money pouring in. If you look at the investment percentages, it reveals another major hurdle. Almost 68% of incoming foreign money during that time was portfolio investment. What does that mean? It means quick financial investments in stocks and bonds, money that can just vanish the second the market looks a bit gloomy. Only about 32% was foreign direct investment, which is the actual physical infrastructure, the factories, and the power plants the country so desperately needed.
Which brings us to part 5, the final assessment, verdict on the turnaround.
So, keeping all that messy execution in mind, let's take a step back and make a completely impartial, high-level assessment of the policy's true impact. The most undeniable win, for sure, was GDP growth. The economy had been suffering a miserable slump, crawling at just 0.8% in 1991. But thanks to these reforms, it steadily recovered to average a record-breaking 7% growth over a 3-year period in the mid-90s. That is massive.
On top of that, wholesale inflation, which had literally been suffocating the economy at nearly 14%, was successfully choked all the way down to 4.4% by 1995. That brought some incredibly much-needed stability to the broader markets.
And crucially, the foreign exchange reserves. These had completely bottomed out at just over $2 billion, but by 1997, they skyrocketed to over $25 billion. This was absolutely critical because it completely salvaged India's global credibility and pulled the nation right back from the brink of default.
But if we're being thorough here, we have to impartially note the policy's blind spots, and there are a few. The reforms were heavily concentrated on the large corporate sector. This meant a virtual neglect of agriculture and small-scale industries, which, remember, were the main sources of employment for the masses. Plus, while wholesale inflation dropped, consumer price inflation stayed frustratingly high, hovering around 10%. That means the average worker didn't necessarily feel this massive economic boom in their own wallet. And finally, huge infrastructure targets were totally missed. For example, foreign firms were supposed to hit certain power capacity targets, and they fell short by an astonishing 46%.
So looking at the whole picture, it leaves us with this final, vital question to ponder. Did this incredible historic transformation truly lift up the entire nation from the ground up? Or did it primarily just save the balance sheets of corporate giants and plug the government's own deficits? The data shows a nation completely undeniably transformed. But as with all major economic overhauls, the benefits weren't distributed equally. It's an absolutely fascinating study of a macroeconomic turnaround and a stark reminder of just how complex saving an entire economy really is.